A pregnant Choctaw widow thought she was just securing winter feed for her struggling ranch until a terrified boy grabbed her dress and whispered words that would expose a conspiracy reaching from the tribal council to the territorial governor's mansion, forcing her to choose between the life growing inside her and the justice that died with her husband. Arizona Territory. Autumn of 1887. The settlement of Devil's Canyon sat like a festering wound between the Choctaw reservation lands and the expanding railroad territories, where progress meant profit and profit meant taking whatever couldn't fight back. The Red Earth had drunk too much blood over the past decade, first from the Apache Wars, then from the range conflicts, and now from something far more sinister that moved in shadows and spoke in whispers about land rights and tribal sovereignty.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Naomi. Pushmataha guided her paint mare through the dusty main street, her 7-month belly making every jolt of the saddle a reminder of the life she carried alone. At 24, she had already buried a husband, lost 2 miscarriages, and watched her family's cattle ranch shrink from 3,000 acres to barely 300 as mysterious accidents and legal challenges whittled away everything her late husband had built. The town watched her pass with the mixture of pity and suspicion reserved for Indian women who dared to own property in their own right, their eyes lingering on her swollen form, as if pregnancy made her both more vulnerable and more dangerous. She had come to buy cattle from Jeremiah Morrison, the only rancher in 3 counties willing to sell to Native Americans, though his prices reflected the risk he claimed to be taking. Her leather saddlebags contained $800 in silver coin, representing the sale of her grandmother's turquoise jewelry and the last of her husband's prize horses. It was everything she had left, scraped together for one final attempt to keep the ranch viable through the coming winter. If this failed, she would be forced to sell to the Territorial Land Commission for pennies on the dollar, joining the long line of dispossessed tribal members who had learned too late that American law protected property only when it served American interests. The Morrison Ranch sprawled across a valley that had once been sacred hunting grounds, its boundaries marked by wooden fences that cut across ancient paths like scars across memory. Morrison himself was a weathered man of 50-something years, gray-bearded and sharp-eyed, who treated business like poker and approached every transaction as if expecting betrayal. He stood beside a pen of mixed cattle, his foreman and 2 ranch hands flanking him with the casual alertness of men accustomed to violence. The cattle were decent stock, not prize animals but healthy enough to breed and hardy enough to survive the mountain winters that could kill weaker livestock in a single storm. "Mrs. Pushmataha," Morrison said, touching his hat brim in a gesture that acknowledged her widowhood without quite offering respect. "Heard you were looking to buy. Have to say, I'm surprised you're still trying to make a go of that place. Most folks would have taken the government's offer and moved on by now." His tone carried the weight of a man who had seen too many dreams die in the unforgiving terrain. But underneath lay something else, a careful neutrality that suggested he knew more about her situation than he was willing to admit. "My husband believed this land could support our family," Naomi replied, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had sustained her through months of fighting lawyers, politicians, and neighbors who saw her pregnancy as evidence of weakness rather than determination. "I intend to honor that belief. The cattle you've gathered look sound. What's your price?" She had learned to speak plainly in business dealings, avoiding the flowery courtesies that white men often interpreted as feminine weakness or Indian deference. Every word was a negotiation, every pause a potential trap. Morrison quoted a figure that was higher than they had discussed in their initial correspondence, but not unreasonable given the season and the quality of the stock. Naomi was reaching for her saddlebags when small fingers clutched at her riding skirt with desperate urgency. She looked down to see a boy of perhaps 10 years, his clothes dusty from hard travel, his face streaked with tears and dirt. His features suggested mixed heritage, the kind of child who belonged fully to neither world, but was claimed by both when convenient. His eyes held the particular terror of someone who had seen death approaching and understood its finality. "Ma'am," the boy whispered, glancing nervously at the ranchers who had stopped their conversation to stare. "Please, ma'am, it's my papa's final hour. They're gonna hang him at sundown, and he ain't done nothing wrong. They say he stole cattle, but I know he didn't. I know who really did it, but nobody will listen to a half-breed boy." His voice cracked on the last words, and Naomi felt something cold settle in her chest as she recognized the particular desperation of someone whose truth had been dismissed because of blood quantum and social standing. Morrison stepped forward, his expression hardening with the kind of anger that came from being interrupted during business. "Boy, you get on out of here. This is private property, and you're trespassing. Whatever story you're peddling, we're not buying." But there was something in his voice, a forced casualness, that suggested he knew exactly who the child was and why he had come. The ranch hands moved closer, their hands drifting toward the revolvers at their hips with practiced ease. Naomi knelt as much as her pregnancy would allow, bringing her face level with the boys. Up close, she could see the family resemblance. In his features, the strong jaw and high cheekbones that marked him as descended from proud peoples who had walked this land for generations before the first Spanish explorers crossed the desert. "What's your name, child?" she asked gently, her maternal instincts overriding the caution that had kept her alive through 3 years of widowhood in hostile territory. "Peter Sunhawk, ma'am. But most folks call me Pete. My papa is Joseph Sunhawk, and they got him locked up in the territorial jail in Prescott. Say he's gonna hang for rustling cattle from the Riverside Ranch, but Papa never stole nothing in his life. He was teaching me to read when they came for him, teaching me the white man's words so I could protect our family's interests." The boy's voice gained strength as he spoke, as if saying his father's name reminded him of his own worth. "Ma'am, I seen who really took them cattle. I seen it with my own eyes, but the sheriff won't hear testimony from an Indian boy. Says my word ain't worth the paper it's written on." Morrison's foreman, a lean man with cold eyes and quick hands, stepped forward menacingly. "Mrs. Pushmataha, this boy's been making trouble all over the territory. His father's a known agitator, always stirring up the tribes about land rights and treaty violations. The territorial judge gave him a fair trial, and a jury of his peers found him guilty. That's American justice, and it don't matter what color skin wears it." But his words carried the rehearsed quality of a man repeating official explanations. That didn't quite fit the facts. Naomi felt the baby kick inside her, as if responding to the tension in the air, and she placed a protective hand over her belly while studying the faces around her. She had learned to read the subtle signs of deception during her legal battles over her husband's estate, the way men's eyes shifted when they spoke calculated lies, the tension that crept into their voices when they defended the indefensible. Everything about this situation felt wrong, from the boy's desperate sincerity to the rancher's aggressive defensiveness. "Pete, who did you see take the cattle?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly across the corral. It was 3 men wearing masks, but I recognized their horses and their way of riding. One was Buck Henley from the Riverside spread, another was Tom Morrison, Jeremy's own son, and the third was a man I'd seen before but couldn't place until later. They drove those cattle to a box canyon about 5 miles north of here, where they rebranded them before moving them to market in Tucson. They were careful about it, professional-like, as if they'd done it before. Pete's voice trembled with fear but remained steady with conviction. Papa found out about it because he was tracking a lost horse and saw them working. When he tried to report it to the sheriff, they turned it around and said he was the thief. The silence that followed stretched like a taut rope, heavy with implications that nobody wanted to acknowledge.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Morrison's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The foreman's hand now rested openly on his gun butt, and the ranch hands had spread out to block the potential escape routes from the corral. Naomi felt the familiar weight of being trapped between competing truths, each carrying its own deadly consequences. "That's a serious accusation, boy," Morrison said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "You're claiming my son as a cattle thief and a liar. You're saying the territorial court system is corrupt. Those are fighting words, and they could get a man killed for speaking them." His tone carried an unmistakable threat, but underneath lay something else, a weariness that suggested he was tired of maintaining whatever deception had brought them to this moment. Naomi straightened slowly, her hand still resting protectively on her belly, and studied Morrison's face with the careful attention she had learned to pay to men who held power over her fate. "Mr. Morrison, I've been fighting legal challenges to my land for 3 years. I've seen how quickly justice can become selective when there's money involved. If this boy's father is innocent, then someone is orchestrating his execution to cover their own crimes. That makes this more than a business transaction. That makes it a matter of life and death." Her words carried the authority of someone who had faced down lawyers and politicians and emerged bloodied but unbroken. Morrison's foreman stepped forward aggressively. "Mrs. Pushmataha, you'd be wise to complete your business and leave. This territory can be dangerous for folks who ask too many questions, especially folks in your condition. Accidents happen to pregnant women who venture too far from home." The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the casual cruelty of men who had made such threats before and followed through on them. Something inside Naomi hardened at those words, the same steel core that had sustained her through her husband's murder and the subsequent attempts to steal her land. "Are you threatening me and my unborn child, sir?" she asked, her voice carrying deadly quiet. "Because if you are, you should know that I am not some helpless widow who can be intimidated by hired men with guns. My husband died protecting our land from thieves and murderers. I will not dishonor his memory by backing down from bullies who threaten children and pregnant women." Pete moved closer to Naomi's side, his young face set with determination that reminded her painfully of her late husband's expression when he had decided to stand against the forces trying to destroy their family. "Ma'am, if you'll help me get to Prescott before sundown, I can show the authorities where the stolen cattle were rebranded. I can prove Papa's innocence. But I can't make the ride alone, and no one else will listen to what I have to say." His words carried the desperate hope of someone who had learned that justice was not automatic, but required courage from ordinary people willing to stand against extraordinary evil. Naomi looked at the boy, then at her mare, then at the cattle she had come to buy with her last money. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. If she helped Pete, she would miss the cattle purchase and likely face the same enemies who had already murdered her husband and were now trying to frame an innocent man. If she walked away, a man would die for crimes he didn't commit, and his son would be left alone in a world that had already demonstrated its willingness to sacrifice truth for convenience. The baby kicked again, reminding her that she carried more than her own life and had responsibilities beyond abstract justice. Morrison watched her internal struggle with the calculating gaze of a man who understood that crucial decisions often came down to individual courage in specific moments. "Mrs. Pushmataha, you're welcome to buy these cattle and go home to your ranch. Nobody wants any trouble here. The boy's father received due process under territorial law. Sometimes justice doesn't feel fair, but that doesn't make it wrong. You have your own family to think about now." His words carried the seductive reasonableness of men who offered comfortable compromises in exchange for moral silence. But Naomi had spent 3 years learning the difference between law and justice. between process and truth. She had seen how due process could be manipulated by men with money and connections, how territorial law could be selectively enforced depending on the skin color and social standing of the accused. Her husband had died trying to expose a conspiracy that reached from local ranchers to territorial politicians, and his murder had been dismissed as a hunting accident, despite evidence that suggested otherwise. Now she faced the same choice he had faced, the same decision between personal safety and moral courage. "Pete," she said finally, her voice carrying across the corral with quiet determination. "How far is it to Prescott?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, marking the moment when neutrality became impossible and ordinary people were forced to choose between complicity and heroism. The baby moved inside her as if sensing the change in her mother's heartbeat, the shift from resignation to resolve. 30 miles if we take the direct route through Devil's Pass," Pete replied, hope flickering in his young eyes. "But that trail's dangerous for pregnant ladies. The safer route through Cedar Valley is 45 miles, and we'd have to push hard to make it before sundown. Papa's scheduled to hang at 6 o'clock, and they won't delay the execution for anything or anyone." His words carried the bitter knowledge of someone who had already learned that official schedules were more sacred than human lives. Morrison's foreman drew his revolver in a smooth motion that spoke of years of practice. "Mrs. Pushmataha, I'm afraid I can't let you leave with the boy. He's wanted for questioning in connection with his father's crimes, and harboring a fugitive is a federal offense. You'll both need to come with us until the sheriff can sort this out." The lie was smoothly delivered, professional in its confidence, backed by the casual violence of men who had discovered that fear was more effective than law in maintaining their version of order. Naomi felt time slow down as options narrowed to a single point of decision. Her mare stood 15 feet away, saddled and ready for travel. Pete was small enough to ride double, and her pregnancy, while limiting her mobility, had not yet affected her horsemanship. Morrison's ranch hands were armed, but positioned for intimidation rather than pursuit. The choice came down to whether she believed in the courage her husband had died demonstrating, or whether she would choose the safety that came from accepting other people's version of truth. "Pete," she said quietly, never taking her eyes off the foreman's gun, "can you reach my mare without getting shot?" The question was asked with the calm of someone who had already accepted the consequences of her decision, who understood that some battles chose you rather than the other way around. The baby kicked one more time, as if offering its own blessing. To whatever came next, the boy nodded once, his young face set with determination that would have made his father proud. "Yes, ma'am. Papa taught me to move quiet when I had to." His words carried the tragic wisdom of children who had been forced to learn survival skills that should have been unnecessary in a just world. Naomi smiled then, the first genuine smile that had crossed her face since learning of her husband's death. "Then let's go prove your papa's innocence." The words were spoken with quiet finality, marking the moment when a pregnant Choctaw widow chose justice over safety, truth over comfort, courage over survival. What happened next would either save an innocent man's life or add 2 more names to the territory's growing list of people who had discovered that standing up for right was often a fatal mistake. What happened next would be retold around campfires for generations. The story of how a pregnant Choctaw woman and a 10-year-old boy outmaneuvered 6 armed men in broad daylight through a combination of desperation, cunning, and the kind of reckless courage that either saves lives or ends them spectacularly. Pete moved like smoke across the corral, his small frame ducking between fence posts, while Naomi created a distraction by stepping directly toward Morrison's foreman, her hands raised in apparent surrender. The moment the gunman's attention fixed on her, Pete vaulted onto the paint mare's back with the fluid grace of a child raised around horses. "Shoot the horse, not the woman," Morrison shouted as Naomi swung herself into the saddle behind Pete. with movements that belied her advanced pregnancy. But his men hesitated for the crucial seconds it took for the mare to bolt toward the corral gate, their ingrained reluctance to harm a pregnant woman warring with their orders to prevent escape. That hesitation cost them everything as Naomi guided the horse through the gate and onto the open range, where her superior knowledge of the terrain gave her advantages that money and guns couldn't overcome. The chase began immediately, with Morrison's men mounting their horses in a thunder of hoofbeats and shouted curses. But Naomi had chosen her route carefully, heading not for the obvious trail to Prescott, but toward the broken country to the west, where ancient volcanic activity had created a maze of canyons, mesas, and hidden valleys that could swallow an army if they didn't know the landmarks. Pete clung to the saddle horn as the mare plunged down a steep embankment, her hooves sending showers of red dirt cascading into the arroyo below. "They're gaining on us," Pete called over the wind, his young voice tight with fear as he looked back at the dust cloud marking their pursuers' progress. Morrison's men rode better horses and knew the value of coordinated pursuit, spreading out to block potential escape routes while maintaining pressure on their quarry. "Ma'am, maybe we should find somewhere to hide until dark. My papa always said sometimes the best fight is the one you don't have." "Your papa was a wise man," Naomi replied, guiding the mare around a cluster of beryl cacti that could cripple a horse with a single misstep. "But wisdom and cowardice aren't the same thing. Sometimes you have to ride straight into the devil's teeth to find the truth on the other side." Her words carried the conviction of someone who had already lost everything once and discovered that survival without honor was just a slower form of death. The baby kicked restlessly inside her, as if sensing the urgency of their flight and the stakes of their mission behind them. The sound of pursuit grew louder as Morrison's men closed the distance through superior horseflesh and local knowledge. But Naomi had advantages they couldn't anticipate, advantages rooted in heritage and necessity rather than wealth and privilege. She had spent 3 years mapping every water source, every game trail, every hidden path in a 50-mile radius around her ranch, learning the land with the thoroughness of someone whose survival depended on intimate knowledge of terrain that could kill the careless or unprepared. The first shots rang out as they crested a low ridge, bullets whining overhead like angry wasps seeking targets. Pete flinched but held steady, his small hands gripping the saddle with white-knuckled determination. "Ma'am, they're trying to wound the horse, force us to fight on foot where they can surround us." His observation carried the tactical awareness of a child who had learned to think like prey in a world full of predators. Naomi angled the mare toward a narrow gap between two red sandstone formations, a passage so tight that pursuit would be forced into single file and couldn't bring their numerical advantage to bear. The horses' sides scraped against stone as they squeezed through the defile, but they emerged into a hidden valley that opened like a secret garden in the heart of the desert. Ancient cottonwoods lined a seasonal creek, their yellow leaves creating a carpet of gold beneath hooves that had learned to move silently when silence meant survival. "This is sacred ground," Pete whispered, his voice filled with the reverence. "Children reserved for places where spirits still walked among the living. My grandmother told me stories about this valley, how it was a place of healing where the old ones came to speak with their ancestors." The valley felt different from the harsh country around it, gentler somehow, as if the violence of the outside world couldn't penetrate the natural cathedral formed by stone walls and ancient trees. But their moment of respite was brief as the sound of horses and shouting men echoed from the passage behind them. Morrison's foreman had tracked them through the gap and was already coordinating with his companions to surround the valley's few exit points. Naomi realized with growing dread that their sanctuary was becoming a trap, a beautiful prison where they could be cornered and eliminated without witnesses or consequences. "Pete, is there another way out of here?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear that clawed at her chest like a living thing. The boy pointed toward the far end. of the valley, where a steep trail switchbacked up the eastern wall toward what looked like empty sky. "That's the Eagle's Path," he said. "Papa showed it to me once, but he said it was too dangerous for anyone who wasn't part mountain goat. The trail's only wide enough for one horse, and there's places where you can't see more than 10 feet ahead. But it leads somewhere? To the old Apache stronghold on Mesa Diablo. From there, you can see all the way to Prescott on a clear day." Pete's voice carried the excitement of someone who had just remembered a crucial piece of information. "Papa said the Apache used it to escape cavalry patrols during the wars. If we can make it to the top, we might be able to signal for help or find another route down." The decision was made for them as the first of Morrison's men appeared at the valley's entrance, his rifle already raised and seeking targets. Naomi kicked the mare toward the Eagle's Path as bullets began chipping bark from the cottonwoods around them. The trail immediately proved Pete's description accurate, rising at an angle so steep that the horse had to scramble for purchase on loose stone and exposed roots. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter as Morrison's men realized they would have to follow on foot or risk losing horses to the treacherous footing. 20 minutes into the climb, disaster struck with the suddenness of a lightning bolt on a clear day. The mare's hoof caught in a crevice between two boulders, and the animal went down hard, throwing both riders clear but landing on her side with a crack that spoke of broken bones and the end of their escape route. Naomi hit the rocky trail with brutal force, her pregnant body absorbing impacts that sent waves of pain through her entire frame. Pete rolled down the slope, his small form bouncing off rocks like a rag doll until he fetched it up against a stunted pine tree 20 feet below. For several moments, neither moved, both stunned by the violence of their fall and the implications of being stranded on foot in hostile territory, with armed men pursuing them. The mare thrashed weakly, her right foreleg clearly broken, her eyes rolling with pain and terror. Naomi forced herself to crawl toward Pete, ignoring the fire in her ribs and the warm wetness that might have been blood soaking through her dress. The baby had gone ominously still inside her, and she fought down panic at what the fall might have cost her unborn child. "Pete, can you move?" she called softly, not wanting to attract attention from their pursuers below. The boy stirred. Gradually, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, but his eyes focused when he saw her approaching. "I think so, ma'am. Nothing feels broken, just banged up considerable." He struggled to his feet, swaying slightly but maintaining his balance on the narrow trail. "What about the baby? Are you hurt bad?" Naomi placed a protective hand over her belly, relief flooding through her as she felt movement responding to her touch. "The baby's alive, but we can't keep climbing. The trail's too dangerous on foot, especially in my condition." She looked back down the slope, where voices were growing louder as Morrison's men began their pursuit on foot. "We need to find somewhere to hide until we can figure out our next move." Pete surveyed their surroundings with the practical eye of someone who had learned to assess survival situations before most children learn to read. The Eagle's Path hugged a cliff face that offered few hiding places, but 30 yards ahead he spotted something that might provide temporary sanctuary. "There's a cave opening up there," he said, pointing to what looked like a shadow in the rock wall. "Might be just a shallow depression, but it's worth checking. If we can get out of sight, maybe they'll think we kept climbing." The cave proved deeper than it appeared from outside, extending back into the mesa's heart like a stone, throat-swallowing light and sound. Ancient pictographs covered the walls, telling stories and symbols that predated written history, speaking of hunts and ceremonies and spiritual journeys that connected the living world to the realm of ancestors and spirits. Pete traced the images with reverent fingers, recognizing patterns his grandmother had taught him to read in the old stories. "This is a vision cave," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "A place where warriors came to fast and dream, to receive guidance from the spirit world before important battles or difficult journeys." The cave felt charged with accumulated prayer and meditation, heavy with the presence of countless seekers, who had faced impossible choices in impossible times. "Ma'am, maybe this is where we're supposed to be. Maybe the spirits led us here for a reason." Outside, the sounds of pursuit grew closer as Morrison's men worked their way up the treacherous trail, cursing the loose footing and the steep angles that made their chase into a dangerous climb. But inside the cave, time seemed to move differently, flowing with the rhythm of ancient ceremonies rather than the urgency of immediate danger. Naomi felt her breathing slow and deepen as she studied the pictographs, recognizing symbols that spoke of protection, guidance, and the eternal struggle between light and darkness. "Pete, tell me about the cattle theft," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything you saw, every detail you remember. If we're going to save your father, I need to understand exactly what we're up against." The boy settled beside her, his young face serious with the weight of testimony that could mean the difference between life and death for the man who had raised him. "It was 3 weeks ago," Pete began, his voice gaining strength as he organized his memories. "Papa and I were tracking our missing sorrel-mar, the one with the white blaze that sometimes wanders off when the moon's full. We followed her tracks to Box Canyon, about 5 miles north of Morrison's place, and that's where we saw them. 3 men working cattle in the moonlight, changing brands with running irons heated over a small fire. You're certain it was Tom Morrison?" "Yes, ma'am. I know his horse, a big bay gelding with white stockings that he's real proud of. And I know his way of sitting a saddle, kind of slouched to one side like his back hurts. The other 2 were Buck Henley from the Riverside Ranch and a man I didn't recognize at first, but I saw him later in town. Turned out to be Deputy Marshal Frank Corso, the one who arrested Papa." Pete's voice carried the bitter knowledge of Simeon, who had learned that badges and uniforms didn't automatically confer honor or honesty. The implications hit Naomi like a physical blow. If Pete's testimony was accurate, then the cattle theft involved not just local ranchers, but federal law enforcement, creating a conspiracy that reached beyond territorial courts into the machinery of federal justice. No wonder the boy's father had been arrested so quickly and his trial scheduled with such unseemly haste. The conspirators needed Joseph Sunhawk dead before he could present evidence that would expose their operation. "Did they see you watching?" "No. Ma'am, we stayed well back and kept quiet. But Papa was real upset about what we'd witnessed. Said it wasn't just about stolen cattle, but about a pattern of targeting Indian landowners and small ranchers who couldn't fight back in court. He wanted to document everything, gather evidence that would stand up to legal challenges." Pete's voice cracked with emotion. He said truth was like water finding its level, that it always came out eventually if you were patient and careful. Outside the cave, boots scraped on stone as their pursuers drew closer. But inside the sacred space, Pete continued his testimony with the solemnity of someone bearing witness to truth that powerful men would kill to suppress. Papa spent 2 weeks investigating, talking to other ranchers who'd lost cattle, checking brand records at the territorial office, trying to build a case that would convince honest lawmen to take action. That's when they came for him, right when he was about to present his evidence to the territorial marshal in Phoenix. What happened to that evidence? Hidden where only I know to find it. Papa made me memorize the location and swear a sacred oath to retrieve it if anything happened. To him, it's detailed records of cattle thefts going back 2 years, with dates, locations, and descriptions of the men involved. Enough evidence to hang the real thieves if it ever reaches honest authorities. Pete's words carried the weight of a sacred trust, the kind of responsibility that transformed children into adults. Through this simple act of bearing witness to adult evil, Naomi felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place, revealing a picture more complex and dangerous than simple. Cattle rustling, the systematic targeting of Indian landowners, the involvement of federal officials, The hasty trial and scheduled execution all pointed towards something that reached beyond local corruption into the heart of territorial politics and federal Indian policy. Joseph Sunhawk hadn't just stumbled across a cattle theft. He had uncovered evidence of a conspiracy designed to strip Native Americans of their property rights through a combination of legal manipulation and extrajudicial violence. The sound of voices outside the cave entrance cut through her growing understanding of the stakes involved. Morrison's foreman was coordinating a search of the immediate area, his men spreading out to check every possible hiding place along the cliff face. Discovery seemed inevitable, and with it would come a confrontation that a pregnant woman and a 10-year-old boy couldn't hope to win against armed men who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill. But Pete had noticed something she had missed, a detail that might represent their salvation or their doom. Deep in the cave's recesses, a current of cooler air suggested the presence of another opening, possibly connecting to a different cave system or emerging elsewhere on the mesa's face. "Ma'am, I think this cave goes deeper. Maybe all the way through the mountain. If we can find the other end, we might be able to get away without them ever knowing we were here." The choice was stark and immediate. They could surrender and hope Morrison's men would show mercy to a pregnant woman and a child, though the evidence suggested such hope was misplaced. They could try to hide deeper in the cave and pray their pursuers would give up the search, though the risk of becoming lost in an unmapped cave system was considerable. Or they could venture into the mountain's heart, following ancient passages that might lead to freedom or to a tomb carved from living stone. Outside, the foreman's voice grew closer as he directed his search with military precision. "Check every shadow, every crack wide enough to hide a rabbit. They're on foot now, can't have gotten far. When you find them, remember we need the boy alive long enough to tell us where his father hid the evidence. The woman is expendable." His words carried the casual cruelty of men who had reduced human lives to tactical problems, requiring violent solutions. Naomi made her decision with the swift certainty of someone who had learned to trust instinct over analysis when survival was at stake. "Lead the way, Pete. If these caves connected to the spirit world for your ancestors, maybe they'll connect us to the help we need." Her words carried more hope than conviction. But hope was sometimes all that stood between despair and the courage necessary to face impossible odds. They ventured deeper into the mountain's embrace as voices and footsteps echoed from the cave entrance behind them, moving toward either salvation or destruction through passages carved by water and wind over geological ages that made human conflict seem as brief and insignificant as summer storms. The passage deeper into Mesa Diablo wound through limestone corridors that had never known sunlight, carved by underground rivers that had flowed here when the world was young and the spirits of Pete's ancestors first walked the red earth above. Their only light came from matches Pete had found in his pocket, each precious flame revealing glimpses of a subterranean world that existed beyond the reach of territorial law and federal authority. Water dripped steadily from stalactites overhead, marking time with the patience of stone, while echoes of their footsteps whispered secrets back from depths that seemed to stretch toward the earth's molten core. Naomi moved carefully through the narrow spaces, her pregnancy making navigation treacherous in passages designed for ancient warriors traveling light and fast through emergency routes between sacred sites. The baby had resumed moving inside her, small kicks and shifts that reassured her the fall hadn't caused lasting damage, but the stress of their flight was taking its toll on her body in ways that couldn't be ignored much longer. Every step sent shooting pains through her lower back, and the cramping in her abdomen spoke of complications that could prove fatal without proper medical attention. "Ma'am, are you feeling poorly?" Pete asked, his young voice echoing strangely in the confines of the tunnel as he noticed her increasingly labored breathing. "My grandmother used to say that babies could sense when their mothers were in danger, that they got restless when trouble was coming. Maybe we should find a place to rest, let you catch your breath before we go any further." His concern carried the premature wisdom of children, forced to become caretakers before they had learned to care for themselves. "I'll be fine until we reach the other side," Naomi replied through gritted teeth, though privately she wondered if the other side even existed, or if they were wandering deeper into a limestone tomb that would claim their bones as offerings to the mountain spirits. The matches were burning dangerously low, and without light they would be trapped in absolute darkness with no way to navigate the branching passages that led away from their starting point, like the fingers of a stone hand reaching into emptiness. The tunnel began to widen after what felt like hours of careful progress, opening into a vast underground chamber that swallowed their matchlight like a hungry mouth consuming illumination. The sound of running water echoed from somewhere ahead, suggesting an underground river or perhaps the same seasonal creek they had seen in the sacred valley, following its own mysterious course through the mountain's interior. Pete's match burned down to his fingertips, and he reluctantly lit their next to last one, conserving the precious flame while they tried to understand the geography of their subterranean prison. "Look there," Pete whispered, pointing toward what appeared to be natural light filtering down from somewhere far above. "That's not matchlight or torch flame. That's honest sunlight finding its way down through cracks in the stone. If we can reach it, maybe we can find a way back to the surface." The light seemed impossibly distant, filtering through what must have been a complex system of natural chimneys and crevices, but it represented hope in a situation where hope had become their most valuable currency. They worked their way toward the light source through chambers, filled with fantastic rock formations that seemed to have been shaped by artistic spirits rather than natural processes. Flowstone cascades resembled frozen waterfalls, while columns of limestone connected floor to ceiling like the pillars of an underground cathedral built to honor gods older than human memory. The running water grew louder as they progressed, until they emerged onto the bank of an actual underground river that flowed swift and clear through channels carved over countless millennia. The river presented both opportunity and obstacle, its current strong enough to carry away anyone who fell into its icy embrace, but also potentially offering a route to the outside world if they could find a way to navigate its treacherous course. Pete knelt by the water's edge and cupped some in his palms, tasting it carefully before pronouncing it safe to drink. The cold, clear liquid provided relief from the dry air of the tunnels and reminded them both that they hadn't eaten or drunk anything substantial since their hasty departure from Morrison's ranch. "Ma'am, this water flows somewhere," Pete observed, his practical mind already working on the problem of escape. "Rivers don't just disappear into the ground unless they come out somewhere else. If we could follow it downstream, maybe we'd find where it emerges from the mountain. But the current's mighty strong and in your condition." His voice trailed off as he recognized the impossibility of what he was suggesting. Naomi studied the underground river with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned to evaluate dangerous options when safe ones didn't exist. The water was perhaps 4 feet deep in the center, flowing fast enough to sweep away anyone who lost their footing. But there were natural ledges along the banks that might allow careful progress for someone with steady nerves and sure feet. Her pregnancy made such travel dangerous but not impossible, especially if the alternative was slow death from exposure or quick death from Morrison's guns. Their deliberation was interrupted by sounds that chilled them both to the bone, the echo of voices and footsteps filtering down from the passages they had just traversed. Morrison's men had found the cave entrance and were following their trail through the limestone corridors with the persistence of bloodhounds tracking wounded prey. The acoustic properties of the cave system carried their words with disturbing clarity, revealing conversations that confirmed Pete's worst fears about his father's situation. "Foreman says we got maybe 2 hours before the hanging," one voice called out, the words bouncing off stone walls until they seemed to come from every direction at once. "If we don't find the boy before then, the old man dies with his secrets, and we lose our chance to recover those documents. Boss ain't gonna be happy if evidence of our operation survives to cause trouble later. The casual discussion of murder and cover-up revealed the depth of corruption they were fighting, the willingness of desperate men to kill children to protect their criminal enterprise. Another voice responded with chilling matter-of-factness. Kid can't have gotten far on foot, especially dragging a pregnant squaw through these caves. We just keep following the tunnel until we corner them somewhere. They can't run. Then we make the boy talk before we finish them both. No witnesses, no problems. The racial slur and dismissive tone spoke of men who had dehumanized their victims to make murder psychologically easier, reducing human lives to obstacles requiring violent removal. Pete's face went pale as he absorbed the implications of what they had overheard. Not only were Morrison's men willing to kill them both, but they had less than 2 hours to somehow reach Prescott, locate the hidden evidence, and present it to authorities who might or might not be corrupted by the same conspiracy that had condemned his father. The arithmetic of survival had become impossible, demanding miracles from people who had already exhausted their reserves of luck and cleverness. "We have to follow the river," Naomi said with quiet finality, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had accepted desperate necessity as the price of potential survival. "It's our only chance to get ahead of them and reach the surface somewhere they can't follow." "Pete, can you swim?" Her question carried weight beyond simple inquiry, representing the difference between shared risk and certain sacrifice. "Yes, ma'am. Papa taught me in the stock pond back home." "But what about you? Can you manage the current in your condition?" Pete's concern reflected his growing understanding that courage sometimes meant accepting help from people who needed help themselves, that survival often depended on partnerships between the strong and the vulnerable rather than individual heroism. Naomi had learned to swim in the rivers of her childhood. Before marriage and pregnancy and widowhood had taught her that women's bodies were often treated as property rather than vessels for their own agency and determination. The skills remained despite the years and changes, muscle memory that transcended the limitations imposed by her current physical condition. "I can manage if we're careful and help each other. The water's cold enough to be dangerous, but it's flowing in the right direction, and that may be our only advantage." They entered the underground river with the careful deliberation of people who understood they were committing to a course of action that offered no retreat and little chance of survival. The water was shockingly cold, stealing breath and sending cramps through muscles already stressed by their underground journey. But the current was strong and steady, carrying them downstream through chambers they could never have navigated on foot, while their pursuers struggled through narrow passages far behind. The underground river wound through a landscape of geological wonders that would have inspired awe under different circumstances, carrying them past formations that resembled everything from cathedral spires to abstract sculptures created by artists with unlimited time and patience. Phosphorescent minerals in the cave walls provided occasional glimpses of their surroundings, creating an otherworldly beauty that seemed to exist outside normal considerations of time and mortality. After what felt like hours of careful navigation, fighting to stay afloat while avoiding rocks and debris that could crush unwary travelers, they began to notice changes in their environment that suggested approaching salvation. The water grew warmer, suggesting proximity to the surface, while air currents carried scents of sage and juniper that spoke of the desert world above. Most encouraging of all, natural light began to filter down from ahead, not the distant glow they had seen in the deep chambers, but the honest brightness of afternoon sunshine. The river emerged from Mesa Diablo through a hidden grotto that opened like a secret door in the mountain's eastern face, invisible from any direction except straight ahead, but providing perfect concealment for anyone emerging from the underground passage. They dragged themselves onto a sandy beach formed by centuries of flood deposits, both exhausted and hypothermic, but alive and free from immediate pursuit. The grotto was perhaps 50 yards deep, sheltered by overhanging rock formations that would hide them from observation while they recovered from their underground ordeal. Pete collapsed on the sand with the boneless exhaustion of someone who had pushed his small body beyond reasonable limits, but his eyes remained alert and focused on their continuing mission. "Ma'am, where are we now? How far from Prescott?" His questions reflected the urgent arithmetic of their situation, the need to balance recovery time against the inexorable approach of his father's execution. Naomi studied the landscape visible through the grotto's opening, recognizing landmarks that oriented her position relative to known geography. The distinctive shape of Thumb Butte was visible to the northeast, while the profile of the Bradshaw Mountains suggested they had emerged, perhaps 15 miles southeast of Prescott. On foot, in her condition, the journey would be impossible. But there were ranches in this area, small operations that might provide horses, or at least transportation for travelers with compelling reasons to reach town quickly. "We're closer than I dared hope," she said, calculating distances and times with the precision of someone whose survival had often depended on accurate navigation. "But we still need horses, and we need them fast. There's a small ranch about 2 miles north of here, owned by a family named Garrett, who might be willing to help if we can convince them our cause is just." Her words carried more hope than certainty, reflecting the reality that strangers were often reluctant to involve themselves in other people's troubles, especially when those troubles involved pregnant Indian women and children telling fantastic stories about conspiracies and corruption. Pete studied her face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read adult emotions for signs of hidden despair or false optimism. "Ma'am, what if they don't believe us? What if they're part of the same conspiracy that killed your husband and framed my papa? We don't know who we can trust anymore." His questions reflected the paranoia that was often justified in situations where corruption had infected every level of authority, where badges and uniforms could hide criminal intent as easily as they could represent genuine law enforcement. "Then we'll find another way," Naomi replied with the stubborn determination that had sustained her through 3 years of legal battles and personal tragedy. "Your father is innocent, and innocence deserves a chance to defend itself. We've come this far on faith and courage. We can go a little further on the same foundation." Her words carried the authority of someone who had learned that justice was not automatic but required individual acts of courage from ordinary people willing to stand against extraordinary evil. They rested in the grotto just long enough to wring out their clothes and recover some strength for the next stage of their journey. But time was their enemy now, each passing minute bringing Joseph Sunhawk closer to a death he didn't deserve, for crimes he hadn't committed. The sun was already well past its zenith, casting shadows that spoke of afternoon, advancing toward evening, and the 6 o'clock appointment with territorial justice that would end their mission in failure if they couldn't reach Prescott in time. The Garrett Ranch appeared as they crested a low ridge, a modest operation with perhaps 100 head of cattle and the kind of sturdy buildings that spoke of people who had learned to make their living from harsh land through persistence rather than profit. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house, suggesting the presence of people who might be willing to listen to their story. Though Naomi's appearance, mud-stained and obviously pregnant, would require careful explanation to avoid suspicion or alarm. As they approached the ranch buildings, a man emerged from the barn with the cautious alertness of someone who had learned that unexpected visitors often brought unexpected trouble. He was perhaps 40 years old, weathered by sun and wind, wearing the practical clothes of a working rancher, rather than the fancy garments that marked successful land speculators or territorial politicians. His hand rested near the revolver at his hip, but his posture suggested wariness rather than hostility. "Ma'am, you folks look like you've had some hard traveling," he called out when they came within speaking distance. "Name's Tom Garrett, and this is my spread. What can I do for you?" His tone carried the careful neutrality of frontier hospitality, tempered by the knowledge that charity could be dangerous when offered to the wrong people at the wrong time. Naomi summoned her remaining strength to present their case with the clarity and conviction it deserved, understanding that their success or failure might depend on her ability to convince this stranger that justice was worth the risk of involving himself in other people's troubles. Mr. Garrett, my name is Naomi Pushmataha, and this is Pete Sunhawk. We need your help to prevent the execution of an innocent man who's scheduled to hang in Prescott at 6 o'clock today. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but every word is true, and we have proof if you're willing to listen. Garrett's expression shifted from caution to interest as he absorbed the implications of her words, the suggestion that territorial justice was about to commit an irreversible error that could be prevented by individual action. His eyes moved from Naomi's obvious pregnancy to Pete's young face, reading the sincerity and desperation that no amount of acting could counterfeit. Ma'am, that's a serious accusation. You'd better come inside and tell me the whole story. If there's truth in what you're saying, then we'd better figure out what needs doing inside the ranch house. Surrounded by the comfortable domesticity of people who had built their lives through honest work rather than political maneuvering, Naomi and Pete told their story with the detailed precision of witnesses, bearing testimony that could mean the difference between life and death. Garrett listened with the careful attention of someone who understood that truth was often stranger than fiction, and that justice sometimes required ordinary people to take extraordinary risks. Tom Garrett's kitchen became an impromptu war room where the fate of Joseph Sunhawk would be decided by people who had never met him, but understood that justice was indivisible, that an attack on one innocent person threatened the foundation of law itself. Garrett's wife Martha, a sturdy woman with kind eyes and capable hands, immediately began tending to Naomi's condition while listening to the extraordinary tale that had brought two desperate fugitives to their door. She prepared hot coffee and fresh bread, understanding that nourishment was as important as moral support for people who had pushed their bodies beyond reasonable limits. This conspiracy you're describing, Garrett said slowly, his weathered face grave with concentration. It explains things that haven't made sense around here for months. Cattle disappearing from small ranches, Indian families losing their land through legal technicalities, federal marshals who seem more interested in protecting certain interests than enforcing actual law. His words carried the weight of someone who had been piecing together fragments of a larger pattern without understanding its true scope until now. Martha Garrett had finished examining Naomi with the practical competence of a frontier woman who had delivered babies and treated injuries. In the absence of professional medical help, Mrs. Pushmataha, you're showing signs of premature labor stress, probably brought on by the physical trauma and emotional strain of your ordeal. The baby seems healthy, but you need rest and proper care, not another dangerous ride across rough country. Her diagnosis confirmed what Naomi had been trying to ignore, the reality that her body was approaching its limits regardless of her determination to continue. How much time do we have? Pete asked, his young voice tight with anxiety as he studied the late afternoon shadows visible through the kitchen window. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the western mountains, marking the inexorable passage of time toward his father's scheduled execution. Every minute spent in planning and preparation was a minute stolen from their rapidly diminishing opportunity to prevent an irreversible injustice. Garrett consulted a pocket watch with the precise movements of someone who had learned to measure time like a precious commodity. It's coming on 4 o'clock now. Prescott's a hard ride from here under the best of circumstances. Maybe 90 minutes for someone on a fast horse who knows the country. But we're not just racing the clock anymore. We're racing men who have every reason to stop us from reaching town with evidence that could destroy them. His assessment carried the sober realism of someone who understood that their mission had evolved from rescue to warfare. There's something else you need to know, Pete said, his voice dropping to a whisper as if speaking the words aloud might somehow make them more dangerous than they already were. The evidence Papa hid, it's not just about cattle theft. It's about a land grab scheme that reaches all the way to Washington, using false accusations and legal manipulation to force Indian families off their property so it can be sold to railroad interests. The cattle rustling was just a way to fund the operation and eliminate witnesses who got too close to the truth. The implications hit the room like a physical blow, transforming their understanding of the stakes involved from a local criminal conspiracy to a systematic assault on Native American property rights, orchestrated at the highest levels of territorial and federal government. Garrett's face darkened with anger as he absorbed the full scope of what they were fighting, the realization that corruption had infected every level of authority they might have hoped to appeal to for justice. "Where did your father hide this evidence?" Martha asked, her practical mind focusing on immediate necessities rather than political implications that seemed too vast to comprehend. "If it's detailed enough to prove what you're saying, we need to retrieve it before we can convince anyone in authority to stop the execution. Written proof carries more weight than testimony, especially when that testimony comes from people the system has already decided to ignore." Pete's answer carried both hope and despair in equal measure. "It's hidden in the old mine shaft up Devil's Canyon, the one that played out 5 years ago and got abandoned when the silver vein disappeared. Papa chose it because nobody goes there anymore, and the hiding place is marked with symbols that only someone who knows the old stories would recognize. But it's a full day's ride from here, too far to reach and get back before 6 o'clock tonight." The mathematics of their situation seemed impossible until Garrett's expression suddenly changed, shifting from despair to calculation as an idea took shape behind his weathered features. "Wait a minute. You said the evidence is in Devil's Canyon, up at the old Esperanza mine?" When Pete nodded, Garrett continued with growing excitement. "That's not as far as you think if you know the back trails. More importantly, I know someone who might already be up there. Someone who could retrieve those documents and bring them to town faster than any of us could make the round trip." "Who?" Naomi asked, though her voice carried the exhaustion of someone whose strength was approaching its absolute limit. The baby had begun moving restlessly inside her, responding to stress hormones and physical trauma in ways that suggested complications were becoming inevitable regardless of their mission's outcome. She needed medical attention, but she also needed to see justice done for the man whose son had trusted her with his father's life. Miguel Santos, the old prospector who's been working claims up that way for the past 20 years. He knows every inch of those mountains, and more importantly, he knows the difference between right and wrong even when the law doesn't. His daughter Maria was one of the girls who disappeared 6 months ago, so he has personal reasons to want this conspiracy exposed. Garrett's words carried the conviction of someone who had found an ally in an unexpected place. Martha was already moving toward a wooden chest in the corner of the kitchen, retrieving items that spoke of urgent preparation for dangerous travel. "Tom, if you're thinking of riding up to find Miguel, you'll need supplies and ammunition. And someone needs to ride directly to Prescott to alert whatever honest authorities might still exist in the territorial capital. We can't put all our hopes on one plan when the stakes are this high." "I'll go to Prescott," Naomi said, struggling to her feet despite Martha's protests and the obvious strain her condition was placing on her body. "Pete needs to guide whoever goes after the evidence, since he's the only one who knows exactly where his father hid it. That leaves me to convince the territorial authorities that they're about to execute an innocent man." Her determination was absolute, but her physical condition made such a journey potentially fatal for both her and her unborn child. Garrett shook his head firmly. "Ma'am, with respect, you're in no condition for a hard ride. And showing up in Prescott, looking like you've been through hell won't help your credibility with officials who are probably already committed to seeing this execution through. Send my son Billy to town with a written statement and instructions to raise every kind of hell necessary to delay the hanging. Meanwhile, Pete and I will ride for Devil's Canyon to find Miguel and recover that evidence." The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through their planning like a knife through silk. Multiple horses moving fast across the hardpan toward the ranch buildings. Through the kitchen window, they could see a dust cloud that spoke of riders pushing their mounts at dangerous speeds, the kind of urgency that suggested pursuit rather than casual travel. Martha extinguished the oil lamp immediately, plunging the kitchen into the gray twilight of late afternoon while everyone moved instinctively away from the windows. "Morrison's men," Pete whispered, his young face pale with recognition as he peered carefully around the window frame. "They must have followed our trail from the cave system, tracked us here somehow. They're not giving up until they find us and silence us permanently." His observation carried the bitter knowledge of someone who had learned that some enemies would never stop hunting as long as their prey remained alive to threaten their interests. Garrett was already reaching for the rifle that hung above the kitchen fireplace, checking the chamber and action with the automatic efficiency of someone who had faced armed conflict before. "Martha, get Mrs. Pushmataha and the boy to the root cellar. If shooting starts, you stay down there until it's over, one way or another. This is my land, and I'll be damned if I let hired killers ride onto it and threaten innocent people under my protection." But Naomi had a different idea, one born of desperation and the tactical thinking she had learned during her legal battles with men who used intimidation and violence as tools of persuasion. "Mr. Garrett, what if we turn the situation to our advantage? What if we make Morrison's men think they've won, while actually using their presence here to expose the conspiracy they're part of?" Her suggestion carried the audacity of someone who had learned that the best defense was often an unexpected offense. "What are you proposing?" Garrett asked, though his tone suggested he was willing to consider almost any plan that might save innocent lives and bring criminals to justice. The approaching hoofbeats were growing louder, suggesting that they had perhaps minutes before Morrison's men reached the ranch buildings and discovered their quarry hiding inside. "They want Pete alive so they can force him to reveal where the evidence is hidden," Naomi explained rapidly, her mind working through possibilities that seemed impossible but might represent their only chance of success. "What if we let them capture him, but in a way that allows us to follow them and document their confession? If we can get them to admit their crimes while trying to force information from Pete, we'll have the testimony we need to stop the execution." Even without the hidden documents, Pete's face went white as he absorbed the implications of what she was suggesting. "Ma'am, you're talking about using me as bait to catch killers who've already shown they're willing to murder children to protect their secrets. What if something goes wrong? What if they decide to torture me or just kill me once they realize I won't tell them what they want to know?" His questions reflected the natural fear of someone being asked to walk voluntarily into mortal danger. "Because," Naomi said gently, placing a maternal hand on his shoulder, "you won't be alone. Mr. Garrett and I will be close enough to intervene if necessary, and more importantly, we'll be positioned to witness whatever they say or do while they think they're safe from observation. Their overconfidence will become our advantage. Their certainty of victory will make them careless with their words and actions." Garrett was studying the tactical situation through the window, watching Morrison's men deploy around his ranch buildings with military precision that spoke of previous experience in such operations. "It's risky as hell, but it might work. These men are used to intimidating isolated victims who have no witnesses and no recourse to justice. They're not expecting to face people who are prepared to document their crimes and use those records against them." His assessment carried the grudging admiration of someone who recognized audacious planning when he encountered it. Martha had been listening to their desperate strategizing with the practical concern of someone who understood that good intentions couldn't stop bullets or prevent torture. "If you're serious about this plan, we need to set it up carefully. Pete needs a way to signal if the situation becomes too dangerous, and you need positions where you can observe without being detected. One mistake, and that boy dies for nothing. While his father still hangs at 6 o'clock, the decision was made for them as Morrison's foreman's voice rang out across the ranch yard, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question or delay. "Garrett, we know you're harboring fugitives in there. Send out the Indian woman and the boy, and nobody gets hurt. Try to protect them, and we'll burn you out and call it justified pursuit of criminals." His words carried the casual brutality of men who had convinced themselves that might made right. Pete squared his small shoulders with determination that would have made his father proud, accepting the burden of being bait in a trap that might save his father's life or cost his own in the attempt. "I'll do it," he said simply. "Papa always taught me that sometimes you have to risk everything to protect what matters most. If this is the only way to save him, then this is what I have to do." His courage in the face of mortal danger reflected the best qualities of both his heritage and his upbringing. Naomi felt the baby kick violently inside her, as if protesting the decision to place a child in such danger. But she also recognized that conventional options had been exhausted by the scope of the conspiracy they faced. "Pete, remember that your father's evidence is hidden at the old mine, but don't tell them that directly. Make them work for every piece of information. Buy us time to position ourselves and document their admissions. If they confess to framing, your father will have what we need to stop the execution." Garrett handed Pete a small object that glinted in the fading afternoon light, a silver whistle that hung from a leather cord designed to be worn around the neck. "This belonged to my youngest son before the fever took him. It makes a sound that carries for miles in this country. If things go bad, if they start hurting you or you think they're about to kill you, you blow this whistle with everything you've got. We'll be close enough to hear it and close enough to act." His gesture carried the weight of a man entrusting a child with his own son's memory. The plan was desperate and dangerous, requiring split-second timing and perfect execution to prevent disaster, but it represented their only remaining chance to save Joseph Sunhawk from an execution, scheduled to take place in less than 2 hours. As Pete walked slowly toward the ranch house door, preparing to surrender himself to men who had already proven their willingness to kill children, Naomi and Garrett moved into positions where they could observe and document whatever followed. While remaining hidden from detection, what happened next would determine not only whether justice could prevail over corruption, but whether ordinary people possessed the courage necessary to confront evil when all other protections had failed. Pete Sunhawk walked across the ranch yard with the steady gait of someone who had accepted that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act, despite terror that threatened to paralyze both mind and body. The silver whistle hung heavy around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt, like a talisman that connected him to the memory of another child who had faced impossible circumstances with dignity intact. Morrison's men watched him approach with the predatory satisfaction of hunters who had finally cornered their quarry. After a chase that had tested their patience and professional pride, from her concealed position in the hayloft, Naomi could see everything that transpired in the ranch yard below while remaining invisible to the men who considered themselves masters of the situation. Her pregnancy made every movement painful, but the pain was secondary to the desperate need to document whatever confessions Morrison's men might make while they believed themselves safe from observation. Beside her, Tom Garrett crouched with a loaded rifle and a small notebook, prepared to record testimony that might save an innocent man's life, if they could somehow get it to the right authorities in time. Morrison's foreman, whose name she had learned was Frank Kellerman, dismounted with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to intimidating children and women without consequences. He was a lean man with cold eyes and quick hands, the kind of professional gunfighter who sold his skills to whoever paid best without regard for the morality of his employer's enterprises. His companions spread out in a loose circle around Pete, cutting off potential escape routes while maintaining clear fields of fire in case Their quarry proved more dangerous than his age suggested. "Well, well," Kellerman said, his voice carrying the mock friendliness that predators used to put their prey at ease before striking. "If it isn't little Pete Sunhawk, the boy who's been causing so much trouble for honest businessmen trying to make a living in this territory, you've led us. Quite a chase, son. But every hunt ends the same way when the hunters know their business." His words carried the casual cruelty of someone who enjoyed the psychological aspects of intimidation as much as its practical applications. Pete stood perfectly still in the center of the circle, his young face set with determination that would have made his father proud despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm his composure. "My papa's innocent of the crimes you've accused him of," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the ranch yard with surprising strength. "He never stole any cattle, and you know it because you're the ones who did the stealing." His accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, marking the moment when pretense became impossible. Kellerman's laugh was harsh as winter wind, devoid of genuine humor but rich with malicious satisfaction. "Your papa's gonna hang at 6 o'clock tonight, boy, and there ain't nothing you or anybody else can do to stop it." The territorial judge signed the death warrant this morning, and the executioner's already testing the rope. "But you might be able to save yourself some pain if you tell us where he hid those documents he was so proud of collecting." His words confirmed what Pete had suspected, that the execution was proceeding regardless of guilt or innocence. "What documents?" Pete asked with the wide-eyed innocence that only children could counterfeit convincingly. "Papa never mentioned any documents to me. He just told me to be good and mind my manners while he was away on business." His performance was perfect, suggesting confusion rather than defiance, buying time for Naomi and Garrett to position themselves for whatever came next. One of Kellerman's companions, a stocky man with scarred hands and the pale complexion of someone who spent his time in saloons rather than honest outdoor work, stepped forward with obvious impatience. "Frank, quit playing games with the kid. We know his old man was collecting evidence about our operation, documenting cattle thefts and land transactions that could cause serious problems if they ever reached federal authorities. The boy knows where that evidence is hidden, and we need to make him tell us before someone else finds it." Kellerman held up a restraining hand, but his eyes never left Pete's face as he studied the boy for signs of deception or hidden knowledge. "Easy there, Dutch. The kid's gonna tell us everything we need to know, but we want to make sure he understands the consequences of lying to men who've come this far to collect what belongs to them." His tone carried the patience of someone who enjoyed the psychological aspects of interrogation as much as its practical results. From the hay loft, Naomi felt her heart racing as she absorbed the implications of what she was witnessing. Morrison's men were confirming their involvement in the conspiracy that had framed Joseph Sunhawk, providing testimony that could exonerate an innocent man if it could somehow be preserved and presented to honest authorities. But Pete was walking a tightrope between maintaining his cover and providing the confessions they needed. One mistake away from torture or death. Dutch was growing visibly agitated, his scarred hands moving restlessly toward the revolvers at his hips as if violence might solve problems that patience couldn't address. "Frank, we're running out of time here. The boss wants this business finished before dark, and if the kid won't talk voluntarily, maybe we need to provide some encouragement. A little pain has a way of loosening tongues, especially young ones that ain't learned to handle serious hurt yet. Tell me about my papa's supposed crimes," Pete said suddenly, his voice carrying the curiosity of someone seeking information rather than the defiance of someone already possessing dangerous knowledge. "If he really stole cattle like you claim, I want to understand how he did it. Maybe then I can figure out where he might have hidden whatever evidence you're talking about." His performance was masterful, suggesting cooperation while actually eliciting admissions that could save his father's life. Kellerman's expression shifted to something resembling approval, as if he appreciated being asked to explain his professional accomplishments to an admiring audience. Your papa got too curious about cattle that were disappearing from Indian ranches and small spreads that couldn't afford to hire protection. He started asking questions about brands that had been changed, about cattle that showed up at market, with paperwork that didn't quite match their original ownership. Smart man, your papa, but not smart enough to understand that some questions are dangerous to ask. Dutch added his own contributions to the confession with the enthusiasm of someone finally able to boast about criminal accomplishments that had required careful secrecy. We've been running cattle from reservation lands to buyers in California for 2 years now, using legal tricks and intimidation to force Indian families off their property so we could claim their livestock as abandoned assets. Your papa figured out the pattern, started documenting everything with the kind of detail that could hang honest businessmen if it ever reached the wrong people. A third member of their group, a young man who looked barely older than Pete himself, spoke up with the nervous energy of someone participating in his first major criminal enterprise. The land grab operation reaches all the way to Washington, kid. We got territorial politicians, federal marshals, even some Indian agents who've been paid to look the other way while we relocate tribes to smaller reservations and claim their former holdings for railroad development. Your papa's evidence could destroy careers and end up getting important people sent to federal prison. Pete's eyes widened with what appeared to be genuine shock, though Naomi suspected he was acting with the skill of someone who had learned to survive by reading adult emotions and responding appropriately. You mean Papa really did find evidence of crimes, just not the crimes he was accused of committing? His question was perfectly pitched to encourage further confessions, while maintaining his pose as an innocent child seeking understanding. Kellerman was warming to his theme now, enjoying the opportunity to explain the sophistication of an Ako and Faven operation that had required careful coordination and substantial financial resources. We needed someone to blame for the cattle thefts, someone whose accusations against white businessmen wouldn't be taken seriously by territorial courts. Your papa was perfect for the role, an uppity Indian who'd been making trouble about treaty violations and land rights. We set him up to take the fall for crimes we committed, then made sure he got a quick trial and a quicker execution from her hiding place. Naomi felt a mixture of elation and terror as she listened to confessions that confirmed Pete's father's innocence while revealing the scope of corruption they were fighting. But the sun was continuing its descent toward the western mountains, marking the passage of time toward an execution that was now less than 90 minutes away. Even with recorded confessions, they still needed to reach Prescott and convince authorities to delay the hanging while they presented evidence of Joseph Sunhawk's innocence. Dutch was growing impatient with Kellerman's extended explanations. His attention focused on practical necessities rather than the psychological satisfaction of confession. Frank, we got what we came for. The kids confirmed that his old man was collecting evidence about our operation. Now we need to make him tell us where that evidence is hidden so we can destroy it before it causes any more problems. Every minute we waste talking is a minute closer to 6 o'clock and the end of our worries about Joseph Sunhawk. Pete seemed to consider this request with the serious attention of someone weighing important decisions, though Naomi suspected he was actually calculating how much time remained before he would need to signal for rescue. If I tell you where Papa hid his evidence, what happens to me afterward? Do I get to go home and pretend none of this ever happened? His question carried the innocent hope of someone who still believed that cooperation might lead to mercy. Kellerman's answer dispelled any such illusions with brutal finality. Kid, you've heard too much and seen too much to ever go home again. But if you cooperate, we can make sure your end is quick and clean instead of slow and painful. That's the best offer you're gonna get from men who've come this far to tie up loose ends. His words confirmed what Pete had already suspected, that his captors intended to kill him regardless of what information he provided. The young gunman who had spoken earlier seemed uncomfortable with the casual discussion of child murder. his nervousness suggesting that he hadn't fully understood what he was signing up for when he joined Morrison's organization. "Frank, maybe. We don't need to kill the kid. Maybe we could just scare him enough to keep him quiet. Make him understand that talking about our business would be bad for his health." His suggestion carried the desperate hope of someone trying to avoid crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Dutch turned on the younger man with vicious contempt, his scarred face twisted with anger at what he perceived as weakness in a business that required absolute ruthlessness. "Tommy, you got a lot to learn about this kind of work. There ain't no such thing as scared enough when the stakes are this high. Dead is the only kind of quiet that lasts long enough to matter, and this kid knows enough to destroy everything we've built here." His words carried the authority of someone who had learned that half measures in criminal enterprises led inevitably to complete disaster. Pete chose that moment to demonstrate the courage that had sustained his people through generations of persecution and betrayal. Standing straight in the center of the circle and speaking with quiet dignity that transformed him from victim to witness. "You killed my papa for trying to protect innocent people from thieves and murderers. You've stolen land and cattle and destroyed families because you thought nobody would care enough to stop you. But you're wrong about that. People do care. And they're gonna make sure you pay for what you've done." Kellerman's hand moved toward his gun with practiced speed. But before he could draw the weapon, the sharp blast of a silver whistle cut through the afternoon air like a cavalry charge, announcing the arrival of salvation. Pete had waited until the last possible moment to signal for help, maximizing the confessions he could elicit while minimizing the time available for his captors to react to the trap that was closing around them. From the hayloft came the authoritative voice of Tom Garrett, backed by the metallic click of a rifle being cocked and aimed at targets who had nowhere to run. "Gentlemen, you're surrounded by witnesses who've heard every word of your confessions. Drop your weapons and surrender, or face the consequences of resisting honest citizens protecting their community from murderers and thieves," his words carried the moral authority of someone who had chosen to stand with justice against overwhelming odds. What followed would be remembered as the moment when ordinary people proved that courage and determination could triumph over corruption and violence. When the testimony of a 10-year-old boy and the sacrifices of a pregnant widow combined to expose truths that powerful men had tried to bury beneath lies and intimidation. The standoff in the Garrett ranch yard lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Though those moments stretched like hours as armed men calculated odds and options, while surrounded by witnesses who had heard confessions that could destroy careers and end lives. Kellerman's hand froze halfway to his weapon as he absorbed the implications of Tom Garrett's ultimatum, understanding that surrender meant federal prison while resistance meant immediate death from a rancher who clearly knew how to handle both rifle and moral responsibility. Dutch and Tommy flanked him like wolves, suddenly realizing they had wandered into a trap, baited with their own arrogance. From her position in the hayloft, Naomi watched the tableau below with the desperate intensity of someone whose own survival and that of her unborn child depended on the next few seconds unfolding without violence. The baby had been moving restlessly inside her for the past hour, responding to stress hormones and physical strain in ways that suggested labor might begin, regardless of external circumstances. But Pete stood safe in the center of the standoff, his young face bright with the triumph of someone who had faced mortal danger and emerged victorious through courage and cunning. Kellerman's decision came with the swift calculation of a professional gunfighter who understood that some battles couldn't be won through superior firepower. His hands rose slowly, palms open, while his eyes never left Garrett's rifle barrel that tracked his movements with unwavering precision. "All right, rancher, you got us dead to rights. But you better understand what you're getting yourself into by crossing men who work for people with long reach and longer memories." His surrender carried more threat than submission, promising future retribution for present humiliation. Dutch was less willing to accept defeat gracefully, his scarred hands twitching toward his weapons, despite the tactical impossibility of winning a gunfight from such an exposed position. "Frank, we can't let them take us alive. You know what happens to men in our business who get captured by federal authorities. We'll spend the rest of our lives breaking rocks in territorial prison, assuming we live long enough to reach trial." His desperation was palpable, the panic of someone who understood that capture meant the end of everything he had worked to build. Tommy's youth showed in his willingness to surrender without the calculation that came from years of criminal experience. His hands shot up immediately, relief evident on his face as he chose life over loyalty to employers who had never shown similar consideration for his welfare. "I give up, Mr. Garrett. I'll testify to everything I heard and everything I done if it means avoiding the rope. These men promised me easy money for simple work, but nobody told me we'd be murdering children and framing innocent folks for crimes. We committed ourselves." The moment of maximum danger passed as Dutch reluctantly followed Kellerman's lead, understanding that resistance was futile when surrounded by armed citizens who had witnessed their confessions and documented their crimes. But Naomi recognized that capturing Morrison's men was only the beginning of their challenge, not its resolution. Joseph Sunhawk was still scheduled to hang in less than 70 minutes, and even with confessions and prisoners, they needed to reach Prescott in time to prevent an irreversible miscarriage of justice. Pete had retrieved the silver whistle and was examining it with the reverence of someone who understood that small objects could carry enormous power when wielded by people with sufficient courage and determination. "Mr. Garrett, what do we do now? We got their confessions and we got them captured, but Papa's still gonna hang unless we can get this information to the authorities in Prescott before 6 o'clock tonight." His practical question cut through the satisfaction of victory to focus on the urgent necessity of translating success into salvation. Garrett was already moving toward the ranch house, his rifle still trained on the prisoners while his mind worked through logistics that would challenge even the most optimistic assessment of their remaining options. "Martha's got Billy saddled and ready to ride with written testimony about what we witnessed here. But we need more than just our word against theirs if we're going to convince a territorial judge to stop an execution that's already been scheduled and approved." His assessment carried the sober realism of someone who understood that justice was often a matter of timing and presentation rather than simple truth. From inside the ranch house came Martha Garrett's voice, strong and clear, despite the urgency of their situation. "Tom, there's a rider coming from the north, moving fast and trailing a dust cloud that suggests he's been pushing his horse hard for miles. Might be the help we've been hoping for, or it might be more trouble than we can handle in our current circumstances." Her observation added another variable to an already complex equation that required perfect coordination to achieve success. The approaching rider resolved into Miguel Santos, the old prospector whose daughter had disappeared, into Morrison's criminal network 6 months earlier. His weathered face was grim with determination, but his eyes held the light of someone who had found what he was seeking after months of desperate searching. He dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades in the saddle, pulling a leather satchel from his saddlebags with the careful attention of someone handling explosives. "Senator Garrett," Miguel called out, his accented English carrying clearly across the ranch yard. "I received your message about evidence hidden at the Esperanza mine, and I have spent the day searching through every shaft and tunnel until I found what the boy's father concealed there. What I discovered is more damning than any of us imagined. Proof of corruption that reaches from territorial courts to federal agencies in Washington itself." His words carried the authority of someone who had risked everything to uncover truth that powerful men had tried to bury. The leather satchel contained documents that would reshape understanding of territorial politics and federal Indian policy for generations to come. Detailed records of cattle thefts, land transfers accomplished through legal intimidation, payments to territorial officials and federal marshals, Even correspondence with railroad companies planning development projects on land stolen from Native American families through systematic fraud and violence. Joseph Sunhawk had assembled evidence that could destroy careers and send dozens of powerful men to federal prison if it ever reached honest authorities. Pete's eyes widened as he absorbed the scope of his father's investigation, understanding for the first time the full magnitude of the conspiracy that had targeted his family and countless others like them. Papa spent months collecting all this information, documenting every crime and every payment and every piece of correspondence that proved what was really happening to our people. No wonder they wanted him dead before he could present this evidence to federal authorities who might actually care about justice. His voice carried pride mixed with grief for a father whose sacrifice was finally being recognized. Naomi struggled down from the hayloft despite Martha's protests and the obvious strain her pregnancy was placing on her body, understanding that her presence was crucial for what came next. The baby had grown still inside her, either sensing the approaching resolution of their crisis or preparing for complications that could prove fatal if medical attention wasn't available soon. But first, justice had to be served for a man whose only crime was caring enough about his community to document the truth about its systematic destruction. We have confessions, we have documentary evidence, and we have witnesses, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had fought legal battles for 3 years and understood the requirements for presenting compelling cases to skeptical authorities. But we still need to get all this information to Prescott in time to stop the execution. 70 minutes isn't enough time for a normal ride, which means we need to do something extraordinary if we're going to save Joseph Sunhawk's life. Her assessment focused their attention on the practical challenge of translating evidence into action. Miguel Santos had been studying the captured prisoners with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned to recognize the men responsible for his daughter's disappearance. These are not the leaders of this conspiracy, he observed quietly. These are hired men, tools used by people with more money and more political connections than common criminals could ever possess. If we want to stop this corruption permanently, we need to reach the men who pay their salaries and protect them from consequences. His words carried the wisdom of someone who understood that cutting off heads was useless if the body remained intact. Garrett had been calculating distances and times with the precision of someone whose life had often depended on accurate navigation under pressure. There's a telegraph office in Cedar Springs, about 12 miles northeast of here. If we can get a message to the territorial capital explaining what we've discovered, we might be able to delay the execution long enough to present our evidence in person. But someone needs to ride there fast, and someone else needs to escort the prisoners and evidence to Prescott for formal presentation to federal authorities. The solution came from an unexpected source, as Tommy, the youngest of Morrison's men, spoke up with the desperate eagerness of someone seeking redemption for crimes that had spiraled beyond his understanding or control. Mr. Garrett, I know the back trails to Cedar Springs better than anybody in this territory. I grew up hunting and fishing in that country before I got involved with Morrison's operation. If you'll trust me to carry your message, I can reach the telegraph office in time to stop the hanging while you transport the evidence to Prescott. His offer carried both hope and risk in equal measure. Kellerman's reaction was immediate and violent, his face twisting with rage at what he perceived as betrayal from someone who owed loyalty to their criminal enterprise. Tommy, you turncoat bastard, you'll hang alongside that Indian if you help these people destroy everything we've built. Morrison's got friends in every courthouse and federal office from here to Washington. They'll hunt you down and kill you slow if you cross them. Now, his threats carried the authority of someone who had seen such retribution carried out against other traitors. But Tommy had already moved beyond fear into the kind of moral clarity that sometimes emerged from witnessing evil at close range. Frank, I signed up to steal cattle and intimidate small ranchers, not to murder children and frame innocent men for hanging. What we've done here goes way beyond anything I can live with, and I'd rather take my chances with federal justice than spend the rest of my life knowing I helped kill good people for dirty money." His words carried the conviction of someone who had chosen conscience over safety. Pete stepped forward with the silver whistle still hanging around his neck, transformed by the day's events from frightened child to young man who understood that justice required personal courage from ordinary people willing to stand against extraordinary evil. "Mr. Santos, my papa always taught me that the spirits of our ancestors guide us when we're trying to do right by our people. If you'll help us get this evidence to the territorial authorities, maybe we can make sure no other families have to suffer like ours has suffered." His request carried the weight of cultural tradition and personal loss combined into a plea that transcended individual circumstances. Naomi felt the first unmistakable contraction as her body finally succumbed to the stresses of their desperate journey, but her voice remained steady as she addressed the group of allies who had assembled around Joseph Sunhawk's cause. "We have everything we need to prove his innocence and expose the conspiracy that framed him. Now we need to execute a plan that gets this information to the right people before 6 o'clock tonight. Mr. Santos, can you escort the prisoners and evidence to Prescott while Tommy rides to the telegraph office and the rest of us prepare for whatever comes next?" The plan that emerged from their desperate conference required perfect timing and flawless execution, with multiple riders heading in different directions to ensure that Joseph Sunhawk's innocence would be established, regardless of which route proved most effective. Tommy mounted the fastest horse in Garrett's stable and disappeared toward Cedar Springs with a written message that summarized their discoveries and demanded immediate intervention by territorial authorities. Miguel Santos loaded the documentary evidence and helped secure the prisoners for transport to Prescott, while Pete insisted on accompanying him to provide testimony about his father's character and the circumstances of his arrest. As the various rescue missions departed in clouds of dust and determination, Naomi finally allowed herself to acknowledge the physical crisis that threatened her own life and that of her unborn child. The contractions were coming regularly now, marking the beginning of labor that could prove fatal without proper medical attention. But she had kept her promise to help Pete save his father's life, and that achievement made whatever personal cost she might pay seem acceptable. Martha Garrett had recognized the signs of approaching childbirth and was already preparing the ranch house for an emergency delivery, understanding that some battles were fought in kitchens and bedrooms, rather than courtrooms and gallows. "Mrs. Pushmataha, you've done everything humanly possible to save that man's life. Now you need to focus on bringing your own child safely into this world, because that baby deserves a mother who's alive to raise it with the same courage you've shown today." Her words carried the practical wisdom of frontier women who had learned to face multiple crises simultaneously, 25 miles away. In the territorial capital of Prescott, a telegraph operator received an urgent message that would transform understanding of territorial justice and federal Indian policy while forcing powerful men to confront the consequences of their criminal enterprises. The message was brief but comprehensive, summarizing evidence that could destroy careers and end lives if properly presented to honest authorities, willing to challenge corruption regardless of its political connections. At exactly 5:47 p.m., 13 minutes before Joseph Sunhawk was scheduled to hang for crimes he didn't commit, Territorial Judge Marcus Whitman received word that new evidence had emerged that cast serious doubt on the convicted man's guilt. The judge faced a choice that would define his career and his conscience, between following established procedures that led to convenient conclusions and accepting evidence that demanded inconvenient justice. The gallows in Prescott's courthouse square had already been tested and prepared, the rope adjusted and the trapdoor mechanism checked for proper operation. Joseph Sunhawk stood quietly on the platform, his dignity intact despite the circumstances that had brought him to this moment. of reckoning. He had spoken no words of bitterness or despair, maintaining the stoic composure that had sustained his people through generations of persecution and betrayal. When the judge's messenger arrived with orders to delay the execution pending review of new evidence, the crowd that had gathered to witness territorial justice fell silent with the collective understanding that they were witnessing something larger than the life or death of one man. They were witnessing the moment when truth confronted power, when ordinary people's courage challenged extraordinary corruption, when justice finally arrived to claim territory that had been occupied too long by expedience and political calculation. In the ranch house kitchen where Naomi Pushmataha labored to bring new life into a world that had almost claimed her own, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the return of riders who carried news that would transform grief into celebration. Pete Sunhawk burst through the door with tears streaming down his young face, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow, the release of emotions that had been held in check by necessity and hope. "He's alive," Pete announced to the room, his voice cracking with relief and exhaustion, and the kind of happiness that follows the resolution of impossible situations through the combined efforts of people who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. "Papa's alive, and the judge has ordered a full investigation of the conspiracy that framed him. Mr. Santos says there's gonna be arrests all the way to Washington before this is finished, that our evidence is strong enough to put the real criminals in prison where they belong." Naomi's labor had progressed rapidly during the final hours of their mission, her body responding to the resolution of crisis by completing the natural process that had been delayed by stress and trauma. With Martha Garrett's skilled assistance and the spiritual presence of ancestors who had guided her through impossible circumstances, she gave birth to a daughter whose first cries announced the arrival of hope in a world that had seemed determined to extinguish it. As sunset painted the Arizona sky in shades of gold and crimson, transforming the harsh landscape into something beautiful and eternal, the survivors of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed their lives gathered to witness the beginning of healing that would take generations to complete, but had started with individual acts of courage by ordinary people who refused to accept corruption as inevitable. Joseph Sunhawk would be released and reunited with his son. The men who had framed him would face federal justice, and a baby girl born during their struggle would grow up in a world where truth had triumphed over power through the simple determination of people who believed that justice was worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.